Welcome to Indianomics. Among the announcements in the G20 that got Indian stock markets excited is the IMEE-EC, or the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. The plan under this initiative is to connect India and Europe through the Middle East. It envisages a network of rail lines in the Middle East which connect India and Europe on either sides by sea. The intent is, one, to encourage more trade, two, to provide green infrastructure, and three, to be a counter to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which had led to rising Chinese influence. Now, the announcement of the economic corridor became a tailwind for Adani Ports, actually, the stock markets on Monday, since that company has already acquired the Israeli port of Haifa. But how much should we expect from this initiative, and how quickly? I have with me an elite panel who would know a thing or two. Ambassador Navdeep Suri, former ambassador to Egypt and UAE, among many other positions. Mr. Rahul Chhabra, former secretary, economic secretary at the MEA, and he has been ambassador to Somalia and other countries in trade relationships. And we also have Somnath Mukherjee, who is the managing partner at ASK Wealth, who wrote a very interesting article in the Times of India. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. Mr. Chhabra, let me start with you, since you have been in the MEA as the economic secretary. If you can tell us, what is your first impression? Is it likely to take off very soon? Is this the start of something big?
Good morning, Latha. Thank you for having me on your show. Yes, it is a big deal, in the words of President Biden itself. I think it's a good way to start off. The important aspect to note and remember is sort of the geopolitical context firstly. Look at the countries. Let's start with the ones in the middle. Saudi Arabia, UAE. And then Jordan and Israel are also part of the deal, though they didn't sign on. In Europe, the three biggest economies, France, Germany, Italy. Italy, by the way, is already having second thoughts on the BRI, which is the only European country that has signed on to it, of the G7. And on this end, India, and of course, all prodded by the US. So there is a huge geopolitical context in which this is being located. Of course, things have quietened down in the Middle East, and US was seen to be ceding space, whereas they are wanting to come back and become a big player in that part of the world. And what better way than to connect one of the fastest growing major economy, a democracy, India, to Europe. And in the slightly longer term, they're even looking at having goods move from Southeast Asia, another huge growth area, through India and into Europe. So it's a big deal which is happening, started being launched just now. It's been 2 years in the making, and it is now, we have just seen the sort of initial announcement.
I think that's an important point that you said it is 2 years in the making. And Ambassador Suri, let me come to you on that. The earlier avatar is the PGII, or the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. That was the G7 version. And even under that version, they'd already given some money to Indonesia during the G20 meeting in Bali. And they've also funded a $15 million health initiative in India. So would you say that it is good to go? There is already a core.
It's good to go, but from a different perspective, Latha. And that is that, what you're looking at is a multimodal connectivity, that you will have a ship sail from Mundra or Mumbai. It'll go to Jebel Ali or Fujairah, unload its cargo onto railroads, freight trains that are ready to accept that cargo. And there's already a link, Etihad Rail, from Fujairah to the Saudi border. There's already a substantial part of a high-speed freight rail link in place from the UAE-Saudi border all the way to the Saudi-Jordan border. You have a missing link of about 300 kilometers within Jordan, which will be from the Saudi-Jordan border to the Jordan-Israel border. And then from the Jordan-Israel border to Haifa in Israel, there's already a rail link in place. So I would say that about 70-75% of the physical infrastructure for this is already in place. The remaining has to be built. But there are issues related to standardization of that infrastructure. Are we talking about the same gauge? Are we talking about containers of the same size, which can be carried seamlessly? There'll be work to be done on customs infrastructure, on regulatory frameworks that all countries sign off to. And once that is done, I think you might see it coming up sooner rather than later. I'll just make two additional points, if I may. One is that I think we need to think about it in terms of the entire conversation about building supply chain resilience. Mm-hmm. Currently, all our trade with EU, and EU is our second largest trading partner as a group, is via the Suez Canal. Mm. We saw what happened when you had that ship getting stuck in the canal. And it disrupted supply chains, and it sent panic waves through the international business community. This creates a handy little alternative to the Suez Canal so that you're not entirely dependent. Second, I think it's what the numbers that the calculations have been done. If on an average it takes a ship 18 days of sailing from, say, Mundra to Piraeus in Greece, or to Italy, or to Marseille in France, this could potentially reduce the transit time to about 10 days. So it's a 40% saving in transit time. And the third is that imagine this not just as a transport corridor, but as a connectivity corridor, because they are also talking about fiber optic cables that will carry data, and they're talking about pipelines. In fact, there's a separate MOU between Saudi Arabia and the US about building a green hydrogen pipeline, which will export green hydrogen from Saudi Arabia into Europe. I was at this India-Saudi Arabia Investment Forum yesterday, and it was interesting to see Saudis present themselves as potentially the superpower for green hydrogen, given their 365 days of sunshine, abundant desert lands, and all of that.
Okay. So, Will, since you two gentlemen have been in ambassadorial positions in both these places, I just want to get from you, Mr. Chhabra, how quickly do you think that this last 300-kilometer rail link can come and trade can really pick up in this route?
It'll take a bit of time. I don't think we should sort of jump the gun so quickly. I mean, they've given a timeline. I'm glad they've already set a timeline of 2 months for the senior officials to meet and sort of structure. There's a lot of loose ends to be done, not just the physical infrastructure that needs to be built, as Ambassador Suri sort of hinted at. There's the regulatory framework, the customs regulations to be in place, sort of inspection. So lots of those sort of formalities also to be completed. And the funding. And of course, the Saudis have already put in $20 billion on the table. There will be more of maybe multilateral funding, private funding. Because once the political intent is there, the most important part of getting all these people on board to be agreed on a concept. So once the big players, the EU, the US, India, the Middle East, everybody is on board as a concept, now the funding will start flowing. And then they'll have to structure it. So it will take some time still before the first goods really start flowing through this.
The funding. And I'm going to come to the tricky question to both of you in just a minute. But let me get Somnath in. He's written a very interesting piece in the Times of India comparing it, or rather putting in context how Lord Curzon tried to build the Middle East as a ring fence it for the British Empire to have a quick trade route to India. But Somnath, would you as a wealth manager, would you start putting any money at all in, say, Adani Ports or L&T, the likely beneficiaries? I mean, L&T already is building a lot in Saudi Arabia. All those green hydrogen projects Mr. Chhabra and Ambassador Suri are referring to, they're already in there. Is it a time already to think of it as something that will come up?
Yeah, thanks, Latha, for inviting me. First of all, I wouldn't be commenting on specific companies or stocks. But in general, is this an investable idea right now? Probably we are a bit too early for that. We have to see how this whole thing pans out, how the whole project gets delivered, conceptualized, and then finally executed. The biggest thing is that the biggest thing going for this project is essentially twofold. One is conceptually the point of China plus one. The same principles that drive producers from significant excess capacity in China, which has driven down costs for every consumer globally, to be reshoring it to various places, whether it's Vietnam, Korea, United States, and also India, at significantly higher costs for them, is what will drive this as well. There is a rediscovery of redundancy as opposed to optimization in trade, in business, in commerce. And we've seen time and time again, Mr. Suri mentioned about the Ever Given ship that blocked out trade on the Suez a couple of years back. We've seen the global financial crisis in 2008. That was a unique outlier example of how too much optimization nearly brought down the Western financial system as we know it. So there is a rediscovery of redundancy and the merits of redundancy in commercial and trade flows. And second thing that goes in favor of this project, besides the fact that some parts of it are likely already in place, like the Etihad Rail, is also the constituent members of the project envisaged. Between the United States, India and Europe, we have probably the best financial expertise and bandwidth available in the world. So unlike the other BRI, which is the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, that fundamentally laid a lot of emphasis on the political side and got victim and became a victim of lopsided financial structuring. That risk is substantially lower in this BRI, which is the Boats and Rails Initiative, if I may use that expression for India, because financial structuring should be high quality, high class, given the constituent members involved. Therefore, while at an investor perspective, it's too early to take a call because we have to see how it pans out. But from a larger long-term perspective, does this have a very high chance of success? Absolutely. And there will be opportunities for investors to participate in the months and years to come.
So not yet an investable idea, but a very good lead for future investments. But you all touched on the funding. Janet Yellen made it clear she will not even increase the capital of the World Bank or their share in the World Bank. Who is going to put money on the table? That question after the break. Welcome back to the discussion on the IMEE Economic Corridor, a new corridor that was announced on the sidelines of the G20 meeting with the G7 countries, India, and 4 Middle Eastern countries participating: UAE, Saudi, Jordan, and Israel. How quickly will this trade route, alternative trade route, come up is what we are discussing with Ambassador Navdeep Suri, Mr. Rahul Chhabra, former Economic Secretary at the MEA and an ambassador, and Somnath Mukherjee of ASK Wealth. Gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Mr. Suri, let me come to that part. The money on the table. You know, the Biden big deal was a very encouraging statement, but when it came to actually funding the talk, we didn't see much when they were trying to reform the MDBs, the multilateral development banks. Please do it without the money, was Janet Yellen's statement. So do you think money will come here?
Well, you know, in this case, you have the advantage that between UAE and Saudi Arabia, you have 2 countries with very deep pockets. Both of them have sovereign wealth funds, which are worth about $1 trillion each. Europe as well as US have separate funded programs for building green infrastructure. So I think if the political will that was demonstrated in New Delhi is executed, then this is one of those cases where the funding per se should not be such a big obstacle. I think the challenge perhaps to have a viable project is, as was being discussed earlier, to look carefully at why the much touted train link from China all the way to UK did not really, I mean, physically it's there, you would carry some cargo, but why isn't it really working? I think the viability is going to be determined by volumes and by costs. It has to be profitable for exporters and importers to use this alternate network. And I think I would draw encouragement from the fact that for India, the GCC and the European Union are two of our largest trading partners. Yes. Our trade with GCC is about $200 billion, and it is very substantial with Europe as well. Now, if some of that trade gets carried on this new highway, so to say, then it has a much better chance of becoming financially viable. But volumes will determine the viability. I think that's critical. That you know, to get the shippers to start using this corridor instead of just depending upon the Suez Canal, for that, the economics is going to be the driver, not just the geopolitics of it. I think the geopolitics is important. Connectivity that brings countries together reduces tensions, and it certainly draws Israel. And incidentally, Israel, even though it wasn't present in Delhi, has been the most enthusiastic advocate. It's even been calling it the peace railway line, or the peace rail corridor. So they see the geopolitical impact of this, but the economics will drive it, I think.
Okay, fair point. But exactly the point that you're making, you know, that the countries have to stay together. The G7's political unity is perhaps now a foregone conclusion. In the Middle East, there could be shifting loyalties as governments change. What would you say, Mr. Chhabra? Do you think that we are being too ambitious? Governments can change, or is the political will confirmed across generations?
No, I mean, I think when governments change, major projects or major commitments of this nature, they don't change. Once given and the ball is set rolling, you don't roll back on issues as big as this. So that would be sort of not really the done thing. And the other part to remember is that it's not just a purely
Mr. Chhabra, what is the historical evidence, sir? What is the historical evidence? There is a reason why the biggest cities in the world are coastal cities. You know, London, New York, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malacca, you name it. Because you don't have to go through landed corridors. Because shifting loyalties of landed kingdoms don't alter these trade routes. Now we are taking a major risk of going through land, so changing governments. Ambassador Suri, you're putting your hand up. Do you think that this is a danger?
I just wanted to say that the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia has been around for 100 years. The Nahyan family has been ruling UAE for about 70, 80 years, certainly, and longer than that, actually. The same goes for the monarchy in Jordan. Israel is the only country which actually sees changes in government. The others are long-term stable monarchies, where you don't really anticipate anything dramatic happening in the short or even the medium term. And in Israel, I think there's a very strong bipartisan consensus about it.
Okay, Mr. Chhabra, if you can complete your point. I mean, my only point is that money...
Just to continue on the list of countries, US, India, the democracies, and France, Germany bought into the project. So I don't think there are going to be changes because the government changes.
I agree.
Yeah, and you were talking about the money.
Yes.
The money would also come in once it's sort of established as a bankable project because of these other aspects of it to be also added. The green hydrogen line, that's important. The high-speed data cable, the electricity cable. So there are other aspects of it which may be just peripheral, but to be also. So once it's absolutely clear that it's going to be a bankable project, there's no lack of funding availability. As the World Bank president has also said, that the private sector really looks for bankable projects. If there are projects, there is enough funding going around, trillions of dollars of funds available, but it's really the shortage of bankable projects.
Okay, to put that to you, Somnath, repeatedly both Mr. Chhabra and Mr. Suri are pointing out it's not just a rail link, sea links, it's also an electricity cable, a hydrogen pipeline and a high-speed data cable. So do you think that there are several sectors in India that could become bankable, investable, even more investable? What are the sectors you would look at?
Oh, absolutely. Only yesterday we had India and Saudi Arabia sign off another MOU about an undersea electricity cable to be constructed between the two countries. So it only increases the viability of the project. And depending on which stage we are in of the project, the opportunities for investors can range from EPC contractors to financiers of the project to telecom companies to high-speed data networks, equipment providers. So the opportunities can be fairly significant and substantial. But micro opportunities about investors at this stage are again too early to gauge. From an investor's perspective, this is a long-term opportunity to keep a sharp eye out on, simply because it has the potential of being extremely large as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it would be exporting hydrogen. There are so many companies that have already thrown their hat in the ring. So, of course, it can be a big deal. But I have just 30 seconds for both of you ambassadors to give us some idea of comparison with Chinese. Ambassador Suri, ultimately, China it's one government giving directions to its public sector units to go ahead and do the BRI. And even then, there were limits. And of course, China is now a weaker economic force. But here there is a multitude of voices agreeing on projects. I mean, it doesn't look like it will be as efficient as BRI. What do you think?
I think the fact that China alone was putting money into those BRI projects meant that financial viability was never the criterion.
Yeah.
It was politically driven. I think in this case, if you are able to establish the financial viability of the trade route, then you are on stronger ground than a project that Xi Jinping has conceived with his team without as much as a buy or leave with the other countries and without looking at financials first.
Okay. Well, Mr. Chhabra, if you also can bolster my confidence. My diffidence is June 2020, it got announced in the G7. Nothing much happened. Again in 22, they called it the PGII. And they've given a little bit to Bali and India, but nothing much. So, it's the initiative actually is about 3 years old already. We have not seen so much on the ground. Are you still confident that this can be a rival to the BRI, to the World Bank, and be a huge infrastructure funder?
You think nothing much happened, but let me tell you, a lot of background work would have happened to have reached this level. It just doesn't happen. You just don't land up and sign an agreement like this.
Okay.
So there were several meetings at several levels, including at the National Security Advisors level. So there's a lot of background work that has gone in to reach this level of understanding. So now it's a clear different template from a model which is much more coercive, not so transparent, not of that quality, high standard. So now here is an alternative template.
Okay.
And you have the largest economies, the largest democracies in the world putting this together as a grouping. So I think it's really something, it's a great significance, and it should now start rolling much faster, that we've got the political in place. That is the hardest part always.
Okay.
Getting these countries, look at the sort of countries, Israel getting together with Saudi and the UAE,
Absolutely.
Jordan being thrown in, and Italy having to backtrack on its commitments to the BRI. There was a lot of things happening in the background before you could actually put a structure like this in position.
Okay.
So now things will start rolling. Now it's the easier part, so to speak.
Okay. Oh, deeply encouraged by what you all say. Mr. Suri, Mr. Chhabra and Somnath, thank you very much indeed for joining me in this conversation. Of course, it's preliminary, but as Mr. Chhabra just pointed out, the difficult part is over and the projects will start flowing more rapidly as time comes. Eagerly looking forward, a new trade route This is historic. Let's hope it moves with Godspeed. Wrap up on this edition of Indianomics. Thank you for watching.